Thank you so much, and thank you for having me here. So today I would like to talk a little bit about the full Flux version of the gyrokinetic code Stella that we have been developing. It used to have the acronym FFS, but we actually had to change this because I was told it wasn't very professional, so this is the last time I think it will be shown in this presentation, and probably at all, and we're changing it to Flux Angulus. Okay, so I'm just going to get going and kind of storm on and start talking about the motivation behind this project and why we wanted to do it in the first place. So as we've kind of heard today, there's been so much progress in designing and optimizing stellarators, one of which has been neoclassical optimization. So as Eduardo actually told us today, this is basically going to lead us into this idea of having homogeneous stellarators. And for that, I mean that the radial drift is just going to time average to 0. So some particles are going to drift away from my surface, some are going to drift towards it, but on average, I expect that to be 0. And the reason that this is nice is because they have a nice property that I can always take a Boozer coordinate transformation and put them into these straight line field coordinates. So here I have a diagram of the magnetic field strength, and I've transformed it into Boozer coordinates, which I have the poloidal and toroidal angles. And in these coordinates, the magnetic field has a very nice property that they are straight lines, as Eduardo told us this morning, which is very convenient for me. So like I said, this is very nice because it means we have confinement of our particles. We have confinement of both trapped and passing particles, and this is a very nice property. So with all of these kind of progressions that we've made in stellarator designs, we need to think about one other thing, and that is turbulent transport. So turbulent transport is going to scale very strongly with the temperature. So if we have any hope for fusion, we have to get this guy under control and understand it very well. So in an axisymmetric device like a tokamak, where the geometry is kind of trivial, we can say, okay, well, whatever field line I choose, if I put this in Boozer coordinates, you can see all of my field lines here are just going to be labeled by different colors. They wrap around themselves because I have a continuous device. And you can see that no matter which one I choose, they're all sampling the exact same geometry. So in a way, these are kind of easy to model because all of my field lines, no matter which one I choose, is seeing the same geometry. And therefore, they're going to kind of have the same properties. However, if I expand this to a slightly more complicated geometry like W7X, like we have here, you can now see that every single field line is seeing completely different geometries. And so it's no longer trivial to just say, I'm going to look at one field line, and I've got all the information that I need. So I've kind of explained to you that if I have these more complicated stellarator designs, I need to be a bit more cautious because these different alphas, which I'm going to use as my field line label, are going to have different geometries, and then they're going to support different modes, and they're going to allow for different things to grow. And not only this, but I also get coupling between different field lines. And so we actually end up with a much more complicated system if I'm dealing with stellarators as compared to axisymmetric devices. So this is of particular interest for me and a lot of people in the community because of zonal flows. So we kind of have a good idea of how zonal flows are going to look inside a tokamak or axisymmetric devices, and we also have a good idea of how they might end up suppressing turbulence. However, we don't have a good handle of how these look in things like stellarators. So one of the main motivations for developing the type of tool that I am trying to show you today is to investigate zonal flows in stellarators. So there are 3 main approaches that we can use to model turbulence in any of these kind of fusion devices. One is going to be using a real space code, one is a flux tube code, and one is the one that I hope to present to you today, which is the full Flux Angulus code. And I would like to take a second to run through each of these in turn to explain how they work, some of their pros and some of their cons, and why I think there is a need in the kind of community for developing this full Flux Angulus code. So I'll start with the real space formalism and just kind of go in order. So as it kind of says on the tin, a real space code is going to model the entire device in real space. So the way that this will work is I take some initialization of my distribution function at time equals to 0, I pop it onto my device, and I'm just going to evolve that distribution function and the fields under the gyrokinetic equation. So this is very nice, and I'm just going to do everything in real space, which means that anytime I get a derivative in my gyrokinetic equation, I'm simply going to use finite differences in my stencil in my real space to evaluate those, and I'm going to go through and do this. So we also have to impose boundary conditions, one of which is periodicity. So you can imagine if I kind of sample my geometry with field lines, it's going to look something like this. So these things are going to wrap around on themselves, but if I'm not on a rational surface, they don't necessarily always match up. So, well, actually, they definitely don't match up if I'm not on a rational surface. So you can see here I have like a stencil of my field lines. But if I'm doing a numerical scheme, where they're going to come back to, so these dashed lines don't necessarily match up to grid points. So I have to do some kind of interpolation between those field lines and the solid field lines in order to have like a closed simulation domain. So this is how we enforce periodicity in real space codes. So we just do some kind of interpolation. So these codes have like a lot of pros to them. They're very good for benchmarking every other code against. They produce a lot of good results, and we have quite a lot of faith in them. However, this can be at the cost of them being quite computationally expensive. Often they need a lot of CPUs and to be run for many hours in order to actually get a result at the end of it. And this is partly because in order to resolve those gyro radiuses very well in real space, I need to have a very dense grid in my alpha direction. So I need to have a lot of field lines. That high resolution can massively slow down my code. So if I really want to resolve those gyro orbit effects, I need a lot of resolution, very computationally expensive. So although they are very good for benchmarking, they can be quite slow and expensive to do. The other thing is, because we're doing things in real space, every time I take a derivative, I'm going to end up needing to do finite differences. Those finite differences have an error associated with them. So I'm not keeping spectral accuracy as I would if I'm doing something in Fourier space. I'm actually propagating errors throughout my code. And the final thing to mention is that these actually have somewhat of an arbitrary boundary condition in the radial direction. So the hope is with these, often you apply the boundary condition far enough away from the flux surface that you care about, and you're going to hope that any kind of spurious effects that are occurring at the edges aren't actually going to propagate into the flux surface of interest. But we do have to do a little bit of checking to make sure that this is the case. The next one I would like to talk about is flux tubes. So a lot of people who do gyrokinetics often run in flux tubes, and I just want to take a second to explain what they are. So flux tubes are going to simulate our turbulence on a domain that looks something like this. It's basically a box in our x and y directions, and it's going to follow my field line around, and I'm just going to allow the turbulence to evolve on this type of domain. So how do we do this? It's exactly the same as in real space. I need to initialize some distribution function at time equals to 0, and I'm going to allow it to evolve under the gyrokinetic equation. However, in these types of codes, often we're going to do this in Fourier space. So I'm going to take my gyrokinetic equation, and I'm going to Fourier transform it in the perpendicular direction to the magnetic field. So that's in the radial and binormal directions. I'm going to take Fourier transforms. So, and then we also need to apply boundary conditions, so ensuring that my distribution function is finite as the velocity goes to infinity. And I'm also going to assume the following. So I need to make sure that this box up here, so you can kind of see the square edges, is going to be big enough that the turbulence across it is going to become decorrelated. So if I do that, I can say that my turbulence at the edges are going to be statistically identical, and I can enforce periodicity in those directions. The other thing, and slightly more complicated thing to do, is you can kind of see that this domain here is kind of ending in thin air. So the two edges just kind of stop. So I need to actually kind of connect these back onto each other somehow in order to have a closed domain. And so this is where the twist and shift comes in. So I'm just going to take a minute to explain what this is and why we even do it. And I'm sure a lot of people have heard the words twist and shift before. I found the more I say it to people, the more I hear I don't actually know what that is. So I always like to take a second to explain what it is. So how should you think of your flux tube? So you should think of your flux tube in the following way. Each of the corners of my flux tube up here, you should think of as being pinned to a magnetic field line. So as I go around the device, like following the magnetic fields, you should think of them kind of tracing along those magnetic field lines themselves. So if I have a system with 0 magnetic shear, you can imagine that this box just stays looking like a box for the entire time. They stay parallel to each other. However, if I have some magnetic shear such that the pitch of the outer flux surface is greater, for example, than the pitch of the inner flux surface, you can imagine as I'm going around, the outer ones are going to move relative to the inner ones. And so what happens to my box is the following. It gets sheared. Okay? So as I move around my device, if I have some magnetic shear in there, the box itself gets sheared. So we end up with two different problems. Oh, and also the eddies within them are going to get sheared to higher wavelengths. So if I have a turbulent eddy existing in my box, it's kind of getting pushed to higher and higher wavelengths. So we have a problem now coming on, because my two edges of my domain are not necessarily in the same location on the device, right? You saw they kind of ended in thin air, but also I have this sheared box now. And somehow I want to connect these two things together. And this is where the twist and shift boundary condition comes in. So the twist and shift is this Fourier equivalent of that interpolation that I showed you in the real space formalism. So when I told you that those two field lines don't necessarily match back up to each other, and I have to interpolate one onto the other, the twist and shift that you hear people talking about is exactly the same. We're just doing it in Fourier space, and we obviously have to give it a very fun name. So that's what we're doing. We're just doing this interpolation, but in real space. And what actually happens is you say, OK, I have any kind of object on my domain, so something real like the distribution function on my field. I'm going to follow it around, and I'm going to insist that it has physical periodicity. So my object can't be multifunction, for example. It actually has to be periodic on the real domain that I'm considering. So if I have a stellarator device, I actually don't have three stellarators linked together in some kind of upward-going helix. It is just a single device that is itself periodic. So you apply this, and what you find is the following. If you go fully around your device, you find that there is a relationship between the wave number at one end of the device and the wave number at the other end. So that's to do with the eddies being sheared. And you also find this phase factor. And that phase factor accounts for the fact that you're now in a different location on your device. And it kind of puts you back into the previous geometry, like linking them back up together. So this twist and shift is not that scary. It's just simply doing this matching up of those endpoints of our domain. So flux tube simulations are really great, especially if I'm considering an axisymmetric device, because like I told you at the beginning, all of these field lines are basically the same. They're all seeing the same geometry. So what I can do is I can do one of these simulations. I can say, well, all the other field lines look identical to this one. So I'm just going to stitch them all together and recreate the entire device. And then we get these really impressive looking images like this, which is actually done with flux tubes, but it looks lovely and global. So these are really great for axisymmetric devices because we can just stitch them together to recreate a device that we care about. Not only that, but they're super fast compared to these kind of real space codes. You know, they're quite quick to do. We can get a lot of different simulations, and optimization is great using these types of things because I can just iterate them multiple times. They're very easy to interpret. Normal modes are very well defined in these types of systems, and I'm actually going to come back to what that means in a minute, but they're quite easy to interpret. We get really nice spectra for these types of codes. They also retain spectral accuracy in their derivatives, so I don't have to worry about these finite differences floating about, because I'm dealing with, every time I have a derivative, I'm going to get k times the thing I care about, so I'm keeping accuracy to all orders, so I'm not carrying around that error. However, if I go to these more complicated devices, I've already told you that the field lines are not necessarily the same. They don't experience the same geometry. So they don't really capture the effects that might happen in something more complicated like a stellarator and W7X, which is the one that I will be presenting to you most often. So if we want to see this coupling between the different field lines, if we want to capture the effects of different geometries, we have to think of something more complicated and go to a full flux surface approach. So that's what I hope to present to you today. And I should say full flux annulus because I'm trying to move away from that acronym that I spoke about. So let me introduce that to you now. So the whole aim of this is to try and model stellarators more trying to get a better approximation for how we're doing these. And we can't use this idea of just a single flux tube and stitching them together. Instead, I want to consider this entire surface as a whole and consider how the turbulence is going to evolve on this, okay? So our domain is now going to be slightly different. Instead of considering a single field line, I'm considering the full flux annulus, okay? So the entire thing, 2 pi toroidal angle, and I'm considering the full poloidal angle now. I still would like to do this pseudo-spectrally because I want to retain my accuracy and my derivatives, so I would like spectral derivatives, and it will also make my life easier when I think of doing gyro-averages, because in Fourier space, gyro-averages simply reduce to Bessel functions. So they make my life much easier in terms of the amount of resolution that I need to capture those kind of gyro-orbit effects. So I would still like to retain the spectral accuracy. So now what I'm going to do, instead of just considering a single field line, I'm actually going to populate the surface with a bunch of field lines. And I'm going to consider that as my new domain. I want to still apply twist and shift because I still have a physically periodic device. My stellarator is still a physical thing. I still need to apply the same twist and shift boundary conditions, but it's just now going to be to an entire surface, not to a single field line. And now, rho star becomes a physically meaningful thing in my calculation. So anyone who's dealt with flux tubes before probably know that rho star is actually formally 0 in a flux tube calculation, and it doesn't enter anywhere. However, now rho star is playing a role for us. So rho star is going to give us a measure of that coupling between different field lines. So if rho star is very small, you can imagine if I consider a small region of field lines, they're not going to be very strongly coupled together. But if I allow rho star to be a little bit bigger, I'm actually going to get a bit stronger coupling across field lines. Okay, so I've told you in this type of code, geometry is no longer trivial. It's actually quite of big importance within my code. But why is this an entire project, and why am I talking to you today, and why is it no longer a trivial problem? Like, why can I not just extend the flux tube problem simply? So let me introduce to you the most simple gyrokinetic equation I hope you have ever seen. So if you haven't studied gyrokinetics, this is all you need to know. I have a time derivative, this pointer, I have a time derivative of my distribution function is equal to a bunch of geometric factors times by some gradients of that distribution function and the gyro average of my potential. So my geometry is entering in two main places. One is the obvious geometric factors, but the other, which might be a bit less obvious, is in these Bessel functions, in these gyro averages. So the first one that is, I hope, more obvious as to where geometry is entering is in these geometric factors. These factors now have alpha dependence themselves, where alpha is labeling the field line. So what happens is when I Fourier transform this, I have two things that depend on alpha. I have these geometric factors, and I have this distribution function. I'm going to end up with a bunch of convolutions. And so now different wave numbers are being coupled in even my linear terms. So before, in a flux tube calculation, these linear terms were really nice to deal with because they were k by k. However, now all of my k's are coupled even in the linear terms. So this adds some complexity. The other place where they enter is in these gyro averages. So when I take a Fourier transform, I've told you gyro averages just go to Bessel functions, so these J naughts. But actually hidden within the argument of these Bessel functions is this, this factor that depends on geometry itself. So these arguments of the Bessel functions have geometry in them. And so this is going to also lead to convolutions in my code. Why does this happen? Well, imagine that I have my gyro orbit that is just following its guiding center. So if I just have a single magnetic field and they're all parallel to each other, that's all great. But imagine now that I have two adjacent magnetic fields that aren't entirely parallel to each other. This gyro orbit is now actually sampling that inhomogeneity in my magnetic field. So this is why it's being introduced as a problem in these kind of gyro averages. It's kind of seeing the fact that my geometry is no longer uniform across the code domain. Okay, so how do I expect this? Before I show you results, before I explain the code, what do I expect to be different, if at all? Do I expect these full flux surface effects to even be important? The answer is obviously yes, otherwise I wouldn't be here presenting. So in a axisymmetric device like the one I have shown here, you can imagine I have all of my different field lines, and they all are all going to experience the same geometry. So if I was to plot ky against growth rate, every single field line should give me the same type of spectra, where I have some peak at a random growth rate, and it's going to kind of decay either side. Now, what about a full flux? So one small caveat I need to kind of mention when I'm talking about full flux and these kind of spectra is because I now have these convolutions, because I now am allowing different k's to be coupled, normal modes aren't as well defined as they were in a flux tube. So when I'm going to show you the following plot, I have to kind of explain what I'm actually doing. So this is what I expect to get in a tokamak, so in an axisymmetric device. So what do I mean when I'm giving you a ky spectra here? What I'm actually telling you is I'm considering a simulation, I'm going to give it a maximum ky that it is allowed to see, and I'm going to plot whatever that growth rate is. And then I'm going to increase the ky in my domain, and I'm just going to plot whatever the growth rate is. And the reason I have to do that is because now all of my ky's are coupled, they're all going to have a global growth rate. So the only way I can get a plot like this is by scanning in the maximum ky in my domain. So it's no longer that I have these nice spectra, because what will actually happen is they will all gain the same global growth rate, and that is whatever is supported by the device. So the reason that we get something like this is it's following the slope of the flux tube, because it's basically taking out whatever the maximum growth rate is if I'm truncating the maximum ky here, for example. But when it gets beyond the peak, it can already see this one, so all of the higher ky's here are just going to flatline at whatever this maximum growth rate was, because they can all communicate to each other. So there is only one global growth rate in this code. So this is for the axisymmetric device. What about the more complicated stellarators or non-axisymmetric